Hey everybody, welcome back to the Pareto Web Application Series. Today is the day 2 here and the second video that we're making. The first video talked about the boilerplate repository that we had set up, kind of went through what the app.js, what the index.js files looked like, what they did. We talked about using React Router. And we also took a look at our home components and our dashboard components. And this is kind of where we left off. So today what we're going to be doing is we're going to actually display some of the data that's coming from our APIs. So right now, as you can see on the right-hand side, we have our technical training topics. We have our finding work, our economic topics, right? Finding community, freelance opportunities, job boards. Here we have our training camp information, which has a list of milestones for you to work through, as well as a step-by-step breakdown of building a portfolio product. And so what we want to do is we want to display a little bit more information about these things, right? So here for the technical training and finding work, we want to display the actual curated pieces of content, which would be very important, right? Because we want people to be able to actually click on the links and be able to get sent to the other websites. And here we want to show people what the requirements for each of these opportunities are, right? So what we'll do for now is we're going to keep it pretty simple. This first iteration probably won't be the final iteration, but what we're going to do is use a modal to pop up and to show more information based on one of these, one of these topics or one of these training categories. So what we're going to do is we're going to reference the documentation for React Bootstrap, which is our UI library. And so we're using a slightly outdated one, version 0.32.4, but as of the time of this writing, it's significantly better than the 1.0 release of React Bootstrap. They've changed a lot of the components, and they've basically eliminated backwards compatibility. And to make matters worse, is some of these components on the 1.0 release are just plain broken. So for now, we're going to use 0.32.4. But anyways, let's go take a look at our components, right? And this is kind of the list of stuff that's available to us, right? It's a pretty big amount, but let's go ahead and jump to the modal for now. And a modal, so y'all can see what it is, this is what a modal looks like. So you have a page, and then you click a button, and then this sub-page pops up in the middle of the page and shifts the focus to that modal. So if we click on this button, that is what a modal is. And I'm sure you've seen that around from time to time, right? It has a header. You can press X up here to exit. You can have some buttons down here, close, confirm, whatever. And it's a pretty flexible it's a flexible piece of UI because you can do a lot with it. You can do confirmation, selection. You can do all sorts of things with it. But anyway, so what we want to do though is when we click on this React Native, when we click on this right here, what we want to do is we want to have a modal pop up, and it's going to populate a list of items kind of similar to what this looks like. But each of the items in that list is going to be a link to some of the content that we have right here. So if we look here in our Node.js category, we have these articles talking about Node.js, what the situation is, what we might want to learn from if we're talking about command line tools. So really we just want to expose this information, right? So let's go ahead and import what we want. And I think here this is kind of the modal experience, right? This is pretty much what we want right here. You know, this has a lot of detail, so I don't know if this is exactly everything that we want, but for now, let's go ahead and let's take this code and let's make a new component here. And we're going to call this component, we'll call this component content modal.js. Whoa, not JJS, just JS.javascript. So let's go ahead and we'll copy this in. First thing we can do, we can delete a lot of this because this is just gumming up the works here. It's really not helping us. Really not helping us with anything. So let's take that out. Okay, so we have this button. Now, so it's using some things here called a popover. What was this popover? So, right, it's a popover, right? Very, very cool, right? It's a cool little thing. It's a tooltip, but we don't really need these things. So let's just go ahead and let's delete them. We keep the button, and we have the modal here. Let's see, we have a button down here. We have a div. Okay, we don't really need this. We don't really need a button. Well, we don't really need this button here. So what this button is this button corresponds to this launch demo modal right here. However, what we need to do is we need to be able to launch this modal and populate it with information from our API every single time from the parent component. So this is going to be a child component. We want to be able to load the props into this component. So, so what we need to do is we're going to need to do a couple things. So first, we actually need to import React and and we're going to change this to content modal, and we're going to just export this class, right? And so here we have two functions. This is called handle show, and what handle show does is it sets the state of show to be true. And as we can see here, the modal has a show value that is equal to this.state.show. So if this.state.show is false, this will not show. If this.state.show is true, then this show will not pop up. However, what we can do is we don't actually have to have this being activated within this component. Show does not have to be dependent on this.state.show. We could actually change it to be dependent on this.props.show, meaning that we can pass down a value from the parent component from the dashboard to this content modal. We could pass down that show. So what we could do is we could actually have show content modal false. We can have this be the default. And we can go ahead and import content modal from the components folder. Right, so dashboard is in the containers folder, so we're going to go one step back and then into the components folder. Okay, and we can go ahead and import this content modal all the way at the bottom. And we can have show is equal to this.state dot show content modal. And we can put it all the way at the bottom because it's just a convenient place to put it logically, because it doesn't have to be at the bottom, it could be anywhere, but putting modals at the bottom is usually pretty sufficient. So we have content modal show equals this dot state dot show content modal, and the default value is false here, right? So what do we want to do with this? So first, let's check that we've imported everything. Right, and then we also need to import a couple of things from React Bootstrap. We need to import the modal, we need to import the button, and let's think about what else we might need to include. Both button, modal dot, overlay trigger. So we actually, remember, we don't care about this, so we can actually delete this. But if we did, we would have to import something called overlay trigger, right? But thankfully, we do not. All we have to do is go ahead and delete this. Righto. Okay. So, right, well, why don't we don't need this button here. So, let's go ahead and we've imported this, right? And now, why don't we put a button? Why don't we get a button over here? And we'll put it right below the header. And what we want to do here in this button is we want to show the modal, right? We want to make sure the modal pops up. And so what we want to do is we want to add an on-click function to this button. And what we'll do is we'll say this.setState show content modal :true. Oh, ho, ho, ho. Interesting. Okay. Now let's try to close it. Oh, what's going on? Can't close it. Why not? Well, I guess we're going to have to reset. So why can't we close that? It's a good question to ask. So let's move this a little to the side. So here, what's going on is in this onClick function, we are setting the state of show content modal to be true, right? And here, the content modal, the show parameter, the show prop, is equal to the value of this.state.show content modal. So here, we're setting it to be true, and we're changing the value of this.props.show from false. Right here, let me pull this up here. We're changing it from being false to being true. So here, this.props.show went from false to being true. So now the question is, how do we want to close? How do we want to close the modal? Whoa. We can press Option Z to soft wrap the text, which makes it all available within the text editor here. So how do we close this? This is a good question. So here we have something called handle close, and it's using this.setState show false. However, you know, that's not really it's not really working here because this.state.show is not really relevant anymore. We're using this.props.show now. So really this is kind of irrelevant almost. But you know, we'll keep it for now, just in case. But here we have handle close and handle show, right? So what we can do is we can modify these functions. We can take them out of here, press Command X, and we can drop them in here. Press Command left bracket or left array bracket to move them up like that. And what we can do is we can bind this dot set state so that it is bound to the this instance here instead of here. So to put it in perspective, if we do handle close right here, this dot set state show colon false. If we access this function within this component, it is going to set the state of show to being false here. However, if we pass this function down as a prop like this, and we try to access this dot props dot handle close, it's going to attempt, or handle show, it's going to attempt to take this dot state and make that show or true or false here. So what's happening is that this dot set state, if this function is activated here, it's going to try to make this dot state dot show false here instead of here. So what we want to do to bind this dot set state to the this instance here, to this execution context here, is we want to turn this into an arrow function. And now, when we pass this function as a prop, what it will do is it will, even if it's activated here, even if we click a button and we activate it here, it's not going to update this dot state here. It's going to update this dot state here. So seeing is believing. So let me show. So handle close equals this. Was this dot handle close, and handle show equals, well, actually, really, all we really care about is this dot handle close. Really, that's really all we care about, because we can open it here, but we need to close it here. So this dot handle close, right? And so what is this dot handle close doing right now? So this dot set state show colon false, but we need to change that because we want to do show content modal to be false, right? So let's go ahead and do show content modal colon false, right? And here what we could do is we can have that, and what we could do here is, instead of actually writing out the full function here, what we could do is we could just add a reference to this dot handle show. Instead of writing out the full function and executing it here, we can have a reference to this function here, and it should still open, but now let's see if it closes. Oh, it's still not working. Uh-oh. Why isn't it working? Well, the reason why is because it's trying to use this dot handle close, but this dot handle close no longer exists, right? Well, actually, it's unsaved, so technically it still thinks it exists. Actually, what will happen is if we actually try to open the component, it's going to tell us that it can't read the property bind of undefined because we deleted this dot handle show and this dot handle close. So what we need to do is we need to delete that, and we need to have the on hide be this dot props dot handle close, and here we could do this dot props dot handle close as well. Now let's see what that does for us. Well, hell, now it looks like things are on the way up, right? We got some things working. Okay, very cool. But now we've come to the part of the show where we need to actually show some data, right? About React Native, right? We want to be able to show the information for the React Native schema here, inside of here, right? So right now we have a query set up that will search for all the pieces of content for a particular type of schema, right? Whether it's React Native or React Web, right? Web schema. If you look on the very bottom, it says localhost :3000/content/web schema. So that is that's the link that it wants to go to. So what we need to do is we actually need to have this function execute when this modal launches. All right, so why don't we copy this? Why don't we copy this? Well, actually, you know what? Let's not copy it. Let's write it out. So we're having async sanity query. We're having an asynchronous function called sanity query, and we're passing in a parameter called schema. And this is going to be a string. It's going to be the name of a schema. So we're going to create a constant called query, which is going to be the result of this API request. And this API request is using Sanity.io's unique, fancy, proprietary query language. It's very similar to GraphQL. Not the most approachable thing in the world, but it's still pretty awesome. And so now what we're doing here, so we've created the query. So we basically created an interpolated string with this schema, and we've used this query as a parameter in the actual sanity.fetch API request. And luckily we've imported sanity right here. Very, very nice. So now that we've gotten the data back, what we want to do is we want to do this dot set state. Let's see here. It says title :data.title, type :data.url, url.data URL. Right. So I guess for now, what we can do is we'll just have content be equal to data. So we're going to set the state of content to become data. And what we're going to do is we're going to have content initially be an empty array. So this content empty array is where all of our educational items are going to come from, right? So all of these things, all these items, that's this data right here. So what we can do is we can do console.log. We can do console.log of this.state.content. And when the content modal pops up, I'm going to go ahead and move this to the bottom so that we have a little bit better visibility, right? So right now it's an array of 0. There's nothing in here, right? And the reason why, well, actually, yeah. And then when you open it up, it'll display again that it's 0. There's nothing in here. Makes sense, right? So why don't we do a quick little test run? Why don't we, so we have React Native, it's called /native schema, or just native schema. Why don't we try running that operation, seeing what's going on? Not a whole lot there. Okay, let's go back here. Maybe let's try that out. Show : false content. Okay, so it's showing us that this dot state, right? This dot state shows false, and inside the content we have an array of 0. Now, Does anyone know why that's happening? Well, the reason why that's happening is because we're not actually calling this function anywhere in the component. What we need to do is we need to come back to one of our best friends, the component lifecycle function called component did mount. And here, all we need to do is we need to await sanity. I think we want to do this dot sanity query. And here what we can actually do is we can actually pass in the parameter here. We can do that. So now, let's see if that helps us out. So it says the content is null. Interesting. So let's take a look-see here. So in React Native, well, it's obviously not null, right? We have 4 items here. And here, the ID is equal to schema. I think I see. Why don't we try this? No, it does not work either. Okay, so this is a great exercise here. So this isn't working. Why isn't it working? Well, there's a couple of things we can do to debug this. When you're faced with a situation when you need to debug something that's not working, it's usually an issue with either the parameters that you are including as parameters in your functions or operations, or you are making a mistake about how you think a particular object or an array is structured, and so you're trying to access a field type or an attribute that simply doesn't exist. So for this reason, what we want to do is really we want to do as much logging as possible. So why don't we console log schema to see what we get? And so here in content modal JS 20, we're obviously getting something called native schema, right? So now that means that that's being passed in over here, and it should be bringing us all of this good stuff. So what that tells me is that it might be an issue with how we are structuring our request here. Perhaps, well, one thing we could do is why don't we console log this dot sanity query. So line number 16, so there's a function called sanity query, and it's returning sanity query.apply. Interesting. So why don't we actually move this, entire operation into the component did mount, because that's probably a better place for it anyway. So we want to have a query, right? Now let's go ahead and console.log this query. and we'll define schema for now as native schema. Or actually, what we'll do is we'll have schema stored here in the state, and for now we'll use native schema. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this now. So our content is still listed as null. Our schema is correctly listed as native schema, I think, and that's listed as false. So here, what we have, and this comes from a legacy web application that we had, and this is just a couple of pieces of code that we pulled from there. So it might very well be that our assumptions about what this query is supposed to be returning aren't very good. So let's go ahead and console log that. Underscore ID equals native schema. So could it be that somewhere along the line here, web schema, native schema, could it be that something is broken? Could it be that it's an issue with our API itself? Could it be that something is not working here? Right, because we have 10 to 15 or so articles here. So what seems to be the deal? Well, what to do in this case is reference code that in the past has worked. This is pretty standard approach to things. It's not that the API is broken, I don't think, because right here, we're making a successful request. This is data that's coming from our API. So our API is obviously serving us some information. Maybe the issue here is that we're trying to take the first element in that array. It doesn't look like it. So let's go ahead and pop open. Let's go ahead and pop open our old repository here. And let's go take a look here at our old web application. And we do Command-Shift-F, sanity query. So, what is going on here? So this.props.navigation.getParam schema. So here in this app, what we were doing was we were getting a param called schema, and we were then running this sanity query with it. So why don't we go into FSA Hub and go open up the React Web, and we can go install. So the FSA, Full Stack Apprenticeship, this was the beta, so to speak, of the Pareto project. It was a meetup that we ran in Seattle for about 6 to 9 months, just doing a lot of research on, how are people learning full stack development in 2019? What are the things they're looking for? What motivates them to keep working at what they're doing? How can we create products to assist them? What kind of services can we offer? What kind of a community can we build to offer support and accountability for people as they're learning? And, we had people contributing random bits and pieces here for an open source project. We ultimately found that it's hard to keep people motivated when they're simply working on an open source project. There needs to be something that's a little bit more beyond that. But let's take a quick look here at how this application worked in the past. And what we're going to do is we're going to do some logging here. So console.log schema, right? Type, text, title, URL, ID. Okay, and so we didn't have that 0 there, interestingly enough. So let's go ahead and start this, and let's take a look at what the old UI was looking like. Localhost 3001. It sure is taking its sweet time. Uh-oh, doesn't have the config module. Lewis. So there's no config file here, which makes a lot of sense, right? Because we don't include it in the open source repository because we don't want people on the interwebs to get a glimpse of our super cool information, right? However, maybe we can figure out what's going on even without this. So why don't we try to replace the query that we had with this one? So what's different? Query underscore type. Interesting. So here it seems that we were trying to pull the ID. We were querying by ID, meaning that we were providing this schema and we were trying to search for the ID of something. However, really what we were trying to do is we were trying to get a query based on the type of schema. Now that might sound arbitrary. What's the difference? But the difference is that's how we actually defined our schemas. We'll go through Sanity.io in a bit and show you how that all works. It's quite a beautiful system, but it appears here that we fixed our issue. So here we have our React podcast resource URL. Yay! Beautiful, right? So now what we want to do is, now that this is fetching this, what we want to do is we want to actually display all of these different resources, right? So how do we do that? Well, the answer is that we want to, the answer is that we want to map over them. And mapping in React is very similar to looping over an array of objects or an array of anything. So a map function essentially takes an array of objects, and for each object or for each element, period, inside of an array, it'll perform a set amount of business logic to operate on and returns individual objects with that business logic attached to them. So as an example, right? So we want to map over the array in this.state.content. So we're going to do this.state.content.map, and we're going to call these resource, and each of them is going to have an index, and what we want to do is we want to return some JSX that has information about each of these. So we have a title, we have a type, we have a URL. So why don't we, just to start with, include the title of each of these resources. So we'll go ahead and we'll call it resource.title. So this resource is meant to symbolize an individual object inside of the array of objects. So this resource applies to 0 or 2 or 8. So what's happening here is we're going to return a div with the title of each of these resources inside of the modal. Okay, so we have our list of resources, right? Now we're getting a warning here in our console here. It says each child in a list should have a unique key prop. So the reason why each child in a list should have a unique key prop is that React wants you to have these keys so that in case in the future one or more of these objects inside of the array this.state.content changes, in case there are any changes, the keys will help React know which ones have changed and will help it perform its state re-rendering more efficiently. So if we add that key equals I, that little message goes away, right? Very, very cool. Okay, so now, but this is kind of useless, right? Because all we're doing is we're just hard coding in this schema, right? That's it. Like, that's all we're doing here. Not really interesting, right? What we really want to do is we want to pass in this prop from these objects right here. So to do that, we're going to go into the dashboard, right? And so let's go to technical trading, right? This.render topics list. And so here, what's happening is we're actually rendering a link container, right? So this link container is trying to send us to a new URL inside of the app. It's trying to send us to /content/topic.type. We don't really want to do that though, because we're going to keep things super duper simple, and for now we're just going to have modals pop up to show us the information. We're not going to get too crazy with it. So what we're going to do is we're going to use these list group items to, when they're clicked on, we're going to change the state of the active category, and based on whatever the active category is, that schema, that's going to come in here and it's going to update what this schema value is. So we're going to change the schema. We're going to change it from relying on the schema this.state. We're going to change it to rely on this.props.schema. So what we're going to do is we're going to add another prop here called schema equals this.state.active schema. Okay? So we're going to go ahead and make an active schema. And, you know, for now, we'll just have none, right? And what we can do is that when somebody clicks on one of these list group items, it's going to update the state. It's going to update the active schema to be that topic dot type. So how do we want to do this? Well, we could add an on-click handler to the list group item directly. So we can say on-click equals this dot set state active schema to topic dot type. And for now, why don't we just set this to web schema? We'll set this to the core basic React bits. Okay. So we click on node, and now let's show modal. Well, it's still showing us React. So what's going on here? So we want to check to make sure that we're actually updating the state, right? So console.log .state.active schema, right? Whoa. We'll come back to that in a bit. And this .state.active schema, this .props.schema. Okay, so we have this array of 15, right? We have web schema. Let's say we want to change it to computer science, to JavaScript schema. Now, let's open this. But the schema is still listed as web schema. Interesting. So even though we've updated the state of this schema here, it still hasn't actually changed. Well, what if we set the state of schema to be this .props.schema and we change this back to this .state.schema? Will that help us? Will that work? Changing it to Git. Nope. Didn't really work. Okay. Huh. That's pretty weird. You know, I thought that if we created a prop here in a child component, if we changed the state, then shouldn't the prop automatically change as well down here? That is an interesting question. What if we turn this into an arrow function? Maybe it's just confused here. Is that it? Somehow I don't think so. So, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to come back to one of our old friends, the component lifecycle. So the component lifecycle will be able to detect when we have a new set of props. So we can use an older lifecycle function called component will receive props. This component lifecycle function is unfortunately deprecated. And what that means is the React team no longer feels that it's worthy of use. But as we can see, I believe, as we will see, no, still not working. Interesting. All right, so let's table that for a quick second here. So actually, let's keep that here. So what is going on here? So show this to say to show content modal schema equals this dot state dot active schema. So let's go ahead and console log this dot state dot schema. So it's web schema. This is the original prop that we are passing in. However, if we click on React Native, that should change this dot state dot active schema right here, right? And according to line 79, it does. However, web schema is still unaffected here. It still hasn't actually changed. That is fascinating. I wonder why that is. So click algorithm schema. So I guess it didn't like that I was using async component will receive props. I guess it doesn't really like that. Oh, I guess it's fine with that. So I guess this worked. So component will receive props, right? So it received the new props. Once we updated this .state.schema, it passed a new set of props down here, right? And those props came into here. However, we didn't do anything with these new props before, but now what we're doing is we're receiving those props and we're setting the state of schema to be the new schema props. So hopefully that makes sense. But like I mentioned, this is not really the ideal way of working with new props. And I think it makes sense for us to take a quick look at why component will receive props has been deprecated. So let's take a look and see what's going on here. So replacing component will receive props with get derived state from props. So it seems that some new lifecycle methods have been introduced, and the release of React 17 will deprecate some lifecycle methods. Now, what version of React are we on? Oh, 16.5. So essentially, when the next version of React comes out, this is not going to be working, boys and girls. So we're going to want to go ahead and not use component will receive props. So what we see here is get derived state from props is one of those newly introduced lifecycle methods. Get derived state from props is a static method which is invoked after a component is instantiated as well as when it receives new props. Since it is a static method, you cannot access this inside this method. Neither you can access any other class method. That's written a little weirdly, but it's okay. Unlike component will receive props, you cannot set state inside this object. So the only way to update state is by returning an object. Whoa. Let's dive into some code, huh? That's interesting. Why am I not able to see that code? That's interesting. Let's see if there's any other. Let's see what else we have here. Refactor component will receive mounts, will receive props to get derived state from props. I wish they would just have a little snippet, but that's okay. Let's go directly to the React documentation. Get derived state from props. Let's go directly to the React documentation here. Let's see here. It's invoked right before calling the render method. It should return an object to update the state or null to update nothing. Interesting. Really wish they would have something here, but that's okay. I wish they would actually just have a little code block here, but they don't. Deriving state leads to verbose code and makes your components difficult to think about. Make sure you're familiar with simpler alternatives. If you need to perform a side effect, for example, data fetching an animation in response to a change in props, use component did update. If you want to recompute some data, use a memoization helper instead. If you want to reset some state when a prop changes, consider making a component fully controlled or fully uncontrolled. This method doesn't have access to the component instance. If you'd like, you can reuse some code between getDerivedState from props and other class methods. Okay, so let's take a look here. For a long time, the lifecycle component will receive props was the only way to update state in response to a change in props. We introduced the replacement lifecycle getDerivedState from props. At the same time, we realized that people have many misconceptions about how to use both methods, and we found anti-patterns that result in subtle and confusing bugs. When to use derived state. It enables a component to update its internal state as a result of changes in props. We do not provide many examples because, as a general rule, derived state should be used sparingly. All problems with derived state that we have seen can be ultimately reduced to A, unconditionally updating state for props, or 2, updating state whenever... what's up, Topher? Okay, we'll come back on call 3 and we'll start again.